We welcome you to the ANU International Law Society career series, Unravelling International Law. We acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples, traditional custodians of the lands on which this interview was recorded. We pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging, as well as any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers. We hope you enjoy episode 9.
My name is Freya Cox, and I'm the 2022 Careers Director for the Australian National University International Law Society. To continue the second season of our career video series, Unravelling International Law, we have a highly esteemed guest, Professor Gillian Triggs, joining us from Geneva. Professor Triggs is currently a UN Assistant Secretary General and Assistant High Commissioner for Protection for the UNHCR, UN Refugee Agency. She was President of the Australian Human Rights Commission from 2012 to 2017 and has been Director of the British Institute of International and Comparative Law in London, as well as Challis Professor of International Law at the University of Sydney. She's an expert in public international law and a fierce advocate of human rights, in particular refugee rights. It is an absolute honour to have you here today, Gillian. Thank you for joining us. Gillian.
Oh, it's a real pleasure.
Thank you. Our first question is that you write in your 2018 memoir, Speaking Up, that in your third year of university, you went to your first public international law lecture and left with a new sense of purpose, that you had found your subject. Once you're admitted to practice as a barrister and solicitor, you were awarded a scholarship for a postgraduate degree in international law in Texas. You then came back to Australia and started working as an academic at Melbourne Uni and completed your PhD in territorial sovereignty. When you were 40, you then went into commercial law as an international lawyer. Could you first tell us about your time working in the field of commercial and private international law?
Oh, well, this was very important to me because I think as an academic, you always feel a little concerned that you're busy writing your papers and enjoying immensely, of course, lecturing in international law, but you're always a little concerned that it's disconnected from the practical world of international commerce. And so I was very, very fortunate to have an offer to join Malice and Stephen Jakes, as it then was in Melbourne. And that really was a remarkable experience because it really gave me the practical commercial skills to build on the more academic ones, so that I found myself working with the oil and gas industry because so much work I had in the past was based on territorial boundaries, continental shelf rights. So I found myself in that world of boundaries in offshore areas, particularly the South China Sea, the Thailand-Cambodia dispute over offshore oil and gas and so on. So I found myself in a completely different world. I feel that having had that commercial experience made me more sure of how the principles of international law work in practice.
Well, that's a really good answer and inspiring for all the ANU students who are completing commercial clerkships. And in Speaking Up, you write that in 2012, you received an offer from Australia's Attorney General for the position of President of the Australian Human Rights Commission. I'm sure ambitious law students listening would like to know, what do you think it was that made you the chosen candidate for this role, and also what inspired you to accept this change in career path?
Yes, it was a change in career path because I was not an international human rights lawyer, and that has to be acknowledged. That was not my field. And when I was offered the position, I said, well, do you realise that, because very often government officials don't understand, quite what your background is. They see this sort of the CVs, but don't really understand what international law means in terms of human rights law. So I do remember saying, look, I love public international law. I love the principles of international law, but I'm by no means an expert in human rights law. But the answer I got back was, well, they wanted somebody with the bigger depth of experience across commercial law and public international law, rather than being somebody who's gone up through the particular track of human rights law. And that was interesting in itself, because you would have thought that a government would go for somebody with more expertise in the human rights area. But I think in the end, it stood me in good stead, because I'm firmly committed to this view, and I hope it's of interest to students, and that is that if you really concentrate on the fundamental principles, then you're much more likely to be able to turn that, whether you're talking about an oil and gas contract with Cambodia, or you're talking about the treatment of Uyghur in China, or 100 million people moving across the globe in search of protection. Whatever issue you're looking at, if you've really concentrated on those fundamental principles, you can move across all of those areas. And that's always been very important to me, to be a generalist international lawyer to begin. And then you can move into specialist areas. But you'll find over a career that those will change, that human rights are very much the thing for a moment, but then you find that's not it. It's trade law, it's World Trade Organization, or it's regional defense policies. So you really never know. And a good lawyer must be able, with fundamental principles, to move across all of these areas.
Yes, absolutely. And I think you were truly an inspiration to many Australians in your time as President of the Human Rights Commission. Would you please be able to tell us what you enjoyed most about this role, and what did you find the most challenging?
Well, that's the most positive way this question has ever been put to me, I must say. It was an exceptionally difficult time, as you can imagine, with a government that was essentially scaling down the work of the Human Rights Commission. It was a very difficult time, especially as at that time Australia was detaining for years families and children who had sought protection as refugees. So I think it was a role that was really challenged, and not only on the particular issue of children and refugees, but it was challenged also because of a decline of support for the Australian Human Rights Commission as a whole. So my job as president was, of course, to ensure that we maintained the support of the people of Australia, who understood the value of the Human Rights Commission. But it was a very tough time, and but I don't regret it at all. I learned a lot. But I also really learned that there's a huge difference between the government position on issues, and I'm not speaking about any particular government, but there's a big difference between their political positions and the humanity of the Australian public. So wherever I went, in rural communities, other cities, in the deep outback, if I can use that phrase, wherever I went, the support for humanitarianism, for refugees, for children in need, was huge. And so I think that sort of trusting in the good initiatives and good spirit of the Australian people really made my job as Human Rights Commissioner or President of the Commission much easier.
Well, that's very uplifting to hear about the human rights spirit of the Australian people.
Mm-hmm.
Your current role is now as a UN Assistant Secretary General and Assistant High Commissioner for Protection with the UNHCR, for which you are based in Geneva. Could you please tell us about the work that you currently do for the UNHCR?
As you say, I'm here in Geneva, which of course is the home of the United Nations human rights work, although obviously the World Trade Organization is here, the intellectual property, and various other sort of groups. This is really the center for human rights agencies. And I'm always reminded, of course, that we have the Palais Wilson just down the road, which was really set up in the aftermath of the Covenant of the League of Nations. But the job itself is a truly global job. And I think when you come from the Australian or Asia Pacific region, which as Australians we know reasonably well, to come into the global environment is a completely different experience. And here, of course, at the moment, we're dealing with the Ukraine situation, with 5.5 million people, refugees now moving across the border, and something in the region of 10 million people in Ukraine itself in need of international protection. So that's a dominant part of our work. But also, we're working in the protracted conflicts. And I was just actually getting back to an Australian colleague of mine asking what I was doing. And I said, in the last year, I've been to 30 countries, Africa, North Central America, looking at essentially the position of people displaced forcibly, both internally and across borders, and the rising numbers, it seems, of people who are stateless as a consequence of conflict. So the challenges are huge, and it's really overwhelming. It's one I'd like to be able to say I'm on top of my portfolio, but you really aren't. You're constantly chasing the next issue, and while of course we're concerned with Ukraine, the horror of it, because it's in a way a traditional war that was the UN Charter was designed to prevent. 75 years later, we are dealing with yet another war that nobody ever really imagined would occur, certainly not in the European context. But at the same time, we have the highest number of refugees from Syria, who are mainly in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt. We have the highest number in a protracted situation, which is now into its 10th, 11th year. We also have 1 million Rohingya from Myanmar now being hosted in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where I've been recently. We have nearly 1 million displaced in the conflict in Mozambique, and untold numbers now moving into Uganda, more than 1.5 million. So there are a lot of global conflicts displacing people that the world is barely aware of. And then we have conflicts that we never expected in Ethiopia, where the president got the Nobel Peace Prize. We have the failure of, in many respects, of the peace process between Sudan and South Sudan. And I could keep on going, and I won't. But the point I'm making is that the role of the United Nations is vast. And the demands on the United Nations are huge. We can meet some of those demands, but not all of them. And especially as we have not only protracted but new conflicts where we are constantly needing to find the funding. And funding, of course, has been forthcoming in Uganda, but we're very concerned that it will have an impact on funding for other conflicts. So I think the job, if I were to sum up, is less the law, because we know the law. It's very clear that the law is being breached. I think perhaps the point that I'm trying to make is that I expected to be spending a lot of time on detailed issues of public international law, but in fact the law is very clear. There are some grey areas, but basically the law is clear, and I think any international lawyer could do this job as a substantive issue. But the thing that's special to the role is the importance of diplomacy. And I think I spend much more time than I ever imagined with ministers, with senior government officials, with our donors, with civil society, trying to find solutions. And sometimes you can achieve something. Other times the issues are so protracted, so difficult politically, that there's not a lot one can do. But I deeply believe in the future of the United Nations. It needs reform, of course, but I think for an international lawyer, this is a very exciting time to be coming into the international system based on the rule of law.
Well, you've already started to touch upon our next question when talking about international conflicts. But my next question is that some people argue that international law can be somewhat of a toothless tiger that has little practical effect in catastrophic situations. What role do you believe that international law can play in current crises, such as the Ukraine crisis?
Well, I think the short answer is very little at the moment. The longer answer is that international law is highly effective in areas that don't threaten the perceived national interest of a state. So the international law keeps the wheels running, the postal services, the airline companies, the right to fly, the diplomatic relations, trade, intellectual property protection, any number of issues, law of the sea, there are endless issues where international law is highly effective. But when you come to issues of national interest, like one might say the Ukraine crisis, then we see a diminishing role for the rule of law. Now, I would have said prior to the Ukraine crisis that international law does have a role to play in some of these issues, and can be highly effective. But when you get to something like a war, an all-out, old-fashioned war, international law plays only a quite small role. We've seen the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, now trying to achieve humanitarian corridors, which appears to have been something of a success But I think then the short answer is that in the current crisis, international law has a small role to play, because this is political, and it is highly personal, and it's linked to Russia's perception of its place in the world and a nostalgic view, of course, of its rights, and a return to, in a sense, imperial Russia, and its borders. So it's something where it's very hard for international law to have an influence in that, but it does around the margins. But it's been a tragedy, for example, to see evidence that international humanitarian law is being breached wantonly. But we now have, and again, an illustration of the role international law can play. We have lawyers gathering the evidence now for prosecutions for the International Criminal Court, and possibly even before national courts. So this may be a different war in the sense that we will have the evidence collected so that those are responsible for it will be held accountable. So I'm not prepared to say international law has no role to play, but I'd have to say at the moment it's a small role.
Well, that was a very insightful answer. Thank you for that. You have also been a great advocate of refugees in Australia and globally. The definition of refugee in the 1951 Refugee Convention is someone who has a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons including race, religion, or nationality. This definition traditionally does not extend to climate change refugees. Do you think it is a problem that individuals fleeing climate change are not recognised in the Refugee Convention? And how do you think their needs should be addressed?
Well, I think, like as we all know, law evolves, and law is often behind the fact. And I think this is really true of climate change. We at the UN Refugee Agency say that many millions, untold, unknown millions, are being displaced as an indirect consequence of climate change. And let me just explain, for example, in the Sahel, in sub-Saharan Africa, we've seen that traditional grazing grounds are now lost with rising heat, and the grass is not growing. So that herders of cattle are moving into areas where there is more agriculture, but that means they are in conflict with more stable agricultural communities. There's also a need to get to water, so that we see in the Sahel, and most recently in Cameroon and Chad, where there's been a conflict over access to water and access to agricultural land in both countries. We see conflict arising, and then we see huge displacement of peoples. So that in the river area between Cameroon and Chad, we see a conflict between those looking for feeding grounds and those using the waters of the river for fisheries. And that's led to 30, 40,000 people moving across the river to safety on the other side within a matter of 2 or 3 weeks. So that's a stark example, but we see it in other contexts where climate change is leading indirectly to conflict that in turn leads to displacement. Now, at the moment, the definition of a refugee depends upon that notion of conflict. So those people are still refugees, even though the original cause is climate change. But we expect that over time, courts, tribunals, governments will increasingly recognize that those who have fled as a consequence of climate change will be seen as refugees. And you might be familiar with some emerging case law from the Human Rights Committee, which is acknowledging that where climate change leads to a threat to life, then it will be possible for that person to be defined as a refugee. Now, that's not the position, we don't have an example of that in case law yet, but I think we can be certain we will have one in the very near future. So the law is evolving, as it always does, and I think it will evolve, and certainly our work is evolving to include climate refugees. And interestingly, we're not getting much pushback against that. It's recognized in our practical work that climate change has a significant impact on the displacement of people across national boundaries and within their own countries. So in a way, we don't want to hoist ourselves on the petard of challenging this when in fact it's happening in practice. So, and again, it's an illustration of how one works in the practical world as distinct from the more theoretical or normative world.
Thank you for your perspective on that very current and contentious issue. My final question is about your career advice for students. So, for many law students, achieving the career goal of working in public international law can be elusive and confusing. What advice would you give to young people seeking careers in international law?
Well, I think I've got two pieces of advice. One is do your homework, get your facts right, and get your law right. That's the bottom line. We all have to do that. And that takes hard work. But when you're clear about the issue you want to be involved in, then I say take the opportunities and take risks. I think there's a tendency perhaps to be a little conservative, a little cautious. And I think when opportunities present themselves, take them, even though it may not be consistent with a direct line for your future. You might have it all mapped out. Life never works out that way, we know. I think when you have an opportunity, take it to learn. And you build, life's about building blocks in terms of building your career. And you can slowly build with experiences and don't say no to experiences when they're offered. But I can also say, and normally I have to say, please don't assume that it's easy to get a job in the UN system. It's exceptionally difficult. But for all the reasons I've been describing, but particularly in the context of the war in Ukraine, we are now scaling new staff members. 200, I think, advertisements have just gone out. But what I'm saying is keep an eye on the UN website because there are opportunities. And but take anything that gets you an experience that you haven't had before. But can I also say that don't neglect, as an international lawyer, don't neglect the commercial aspects of international law. They're very, very important, again, as building blocks. You may not forever be an oil and gas lawyer, as I was for some time, or you may not work forever with the World Trade Organization or on regional trade agreements or intellectual property. But all of those skills will stand you in good stead for moving into other aspects of international law. There's a lot of competition amongst international human rights lawyers. I'm very proud of the fact that Australia is so strong in international law and so strong in international human rights lawyers. And I think we have every reason to be proud of that. It's remarkable. I mean, you see it all over the international environment. That Australian accent is there everywhere. Working hard, staying and delivering, as the Secretary General has asked us to do. But I would suggest that to students that they think about other aspects of the international legal system, not only human rights. It's enormously important, but the competition is ferocious, and you probably have a better chance of getting into the system in the other areas. But basically, I'd say seize the day, take risks, take every opportunity offered, and be prepared for. You won't earn much money. That's very clear. I think you can give up on that idea, but you can have the most rewarding professional career and work with deeply committed people from all over the world that I think is really an unbeatable experience for one's professional life, and also for at a personal level, working with people who believe in the rule of law and understand why it's so important in these very troubled times. That is a real privilege. So I think it's something that young people, young Australians can aspire to and make, I think, a really remarkable contribution.
Well, that was some fabulous advice. Thank you so much for that. That concludes our interview. I want to thank you so much on behalf of the ANU International Law Society for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to speak to me today. It was wonderful to be able to hear your insights and discuss your experiences. I'm sure many ANU students listening will find it inspiring.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck to the ANU students who tune into this. And thank you for putting the time into such great questions.